Hi guys, welcome back to Writing Things. I know this Sunday's video was going to be how I would write the next Star Wars, but I have 3 videos to record today and my voice is not feeling it. For any of you who can tell, I'm still sick. So these are just some basic breakdown tips of how I formulate my writing process and how it makes it easier for me, particularly on the first draft, but also going back through on the rewrites as well, which I'll touch on as we go through. As always, don't have the tech to put anything on screen, so grab your pen and paper, your green tea and your packet of tissues, not because you're masturbating over me, but because you might be sick. Point number 1, when it comes to writing my stories, 95% of the time I write in chronological order. I say 95% of the time because there are a couple of times why I haven't, but one was due to a mistake and one was because I actually wanted to entice the readers in. I'll get onto that in a bit, but the reason I write chronologically is something I touched upon in my video for how I plot my stories, and this is the big moment. As I said in my plotting video, you might have these big moments in your head where it's a character betrayal, an action scene, a plot twist, a love scene, something like that, and you might want to go and write that first. But the reason that even though I might have these ideas in my head, I don't go directly to it is because the story itself can change. Something I might be building up to or I want to see might happen later in a book. And if I write that piece first and then I'll write the rest of my book, not only am I taking away the experience for myself of how it got to there, but the story itself I'm plotting and constructing to get fully to that point with no character breathing moments. That big moment can change throughout the course of your book, and if you have something happen in chapter 16, the first 15 chapters might change how that happens. The 2 characters you might have in this moment, one might have not made it that far with something else that you've done. And if you try and keep that character alive, it might not make sense to your story. Basically, the reason I write chronologically is because when it gets to that big point, I need it all to flow up to there perfectly. As a writer, it's exciting to get to that point, but it can also damage yourself if you've already written that part and something massively has changed that would make that part have no sense or logical reasoning for why it's happening. Writing chronologically just helps your story breathe and just helps you get past those moments that it could be quite dull in the middle between if you want something certain to happen in chapter 3 and something certain to happen in chapter 6, a bit more exciting moments. If you write those moments first, the bits in chapters 4 and 5 could feel a little bit dull and it feels just like you're passing time to get there. Whereas if you're doing it chronologically, everything that you're writing in each individual chapter, it might not be the most exciting chapter in the world, but it will make sense of how your characters are getting to the bits that you want the reader to get to. And I said I've done it 95% of the time. One time, or one of the 2 times I haven't done it, is The Taste Beneath, where a flashback scene was actually going to be my chapters 1 and 2. And when I sat back and realised I can't have chapters 1 and 2 because then I've got to try and write 7 years before I get to the part that is supposed to be the beginning of The Taste Beneath. It didn't make sense, so it was better for me to start just with where The Taste Beneath starts than have those first 2 chapters as a flashback scene. I've also done it in my 3rd book, Insidious Valor. It's a bit of a prologue to something that's going to happen later, and I've left it as kind of like one of those nail biting, what's happening kind of moments, just to hook the reader in and let them wonder, when chapter 1 kicks in, how did Ryan get from chapter 1 to what they'd read just before that? I did that with Insidious Valor as well because it helped get me in the motivation as well to start the book. It actually was the first thing I wrote, and I have gone back to rewrite it multiple times. So when it features on later in the book, it does make sense and both of the scenes make sense, but it was more to keep the reader on edge and just get my arse in gear and think, okay, I want to get to this point, but I'm not going to dive into it too much. This is just going to be a bit of bait. So I do recommend writing in chronological order in terms of your story. It will just help it naturally, organically grow, and you won't force yourself between. If you write all of your exciting bits first and then you have to fill in the middle blanks, the middle bit of your book could become stale for you as a writer because you're just waiting to get there. And it also might not help your plot if you're forcing your characters to do certain things to help them get to these next bits. It will save you a lot of time rewriting as well. Point number 2, character dialogue. And when this comes to my characters, particularly some of my protagonists, I don't actually write in who is talking. I just write the dialogue itself. Essentially, I'll write that question, that answer, that question, that answer. Obviously, it's not always a question and answer. It's a back and forth, but I don't write who is talking because I just want the conversation to flow. I want it to be as natural as possible. I don't add in any particular character beats. The only time I might reference what a character is doing is if it is more of a raised voice or more of a concern, that kind of thing, just to remind myself where this conversation is leading when it comes to the rewrites. It helps you get these moments out, and some dialogues that you have in TV shows, books, movies, all this kind of stuff, the better ones are written where there is no influence or no particular focus on what any character is doing. I feel myself, if I'm writing Ryan and Mikey having a conversation, and I write what hypothetically Ryan asks, and then I mention that Ryan puts his mug of tea on the table or whatever, and then I write Mikey's question and Mikey's answer, and Mikey's answer is blah 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 blah, whilst picking up the TV remote or whatever. I feel like it slows the conversation down, and it doesn't add that authenticity. It doesn't add that authenticity to it. I'm not making up. I'm struggling to form words at the moment. I look at it as when me and my friends have conversations. One of my best friends in real life is actually called Mikey, and when we're having a conversation, whether we're outside having a smoke, we don't tend to focus on what each other is doing. The conversation is about what we're talking about, whether we agree, disagree, we're pointing stuff out, or we're trying to figure something out that we could do in the future. The only time me and Mikey tend to focus on each other is if he's going to smoke a cigarette and I see he hasn't got a lighter, so I pass him a lighter. That's that kind of thing. But on the first writing through, I don't really add any character beats or character movements to it. It helps your writing flow faster as well. And once you've got because you will shorten down that dialogue quite a lot, particularly when it comes to the pacing of your story. And you can take certain sentences and put two together. So instead of it being this long script, you can halven it, but you tend to do that on the rewrites, and then you add in your character beats, the moments and such like that, to flesh it out. As I said, my books are very character driven, so I want it to be as 100% as natural as possible. So when it comes to writing the dialogue, I just wham it out and imagine how this person would answer this question, and then who agrees with what, and it's just a lot more natural. I can't think of words at the moment. Coming in with point number 3 is similar to character dialogue, but it's a little bit different. It's in terms of scenery. Now this is kind of a tough one, because obviously you do need to mention where your characters are going, but when it comes to my first draft, I only really write down the major points of where they need to know. For example, if they're going outside and they're getting into a vehicle and then they start driving, I will write that part, but I will not mention particularly straight away what the weather is, unless the weather is a main factor, or their feet, walking across crumpled tarmac, weeds growing out from the building sides. I don't add any scenery detail until later on, unless it's part of the plot, and it's specifically if I'm describing a new place. The first draft, I will mention that they went to an abandoned shopping centre to an abandoned theatre, and it was roughly, let's say, 200 yards between the two. I will add in those points, but I do not flush anything in that doesn't need to be there until at least maybe the 4th or 5th rewrite. Kind of like when it comes to adding dialogue or adding flesh to the dialogue, it just helps you get through that part of your story so much quicker, but you're not rushing it at the same time. Because if you have your plot written down like I do, and if you understand what your character's going through, and you can envision the town, the countryside, whatever in your head, then you don't necessarily need to put it away, and it will not disrupt your flow when it comes to your writing. Your first draft is always not going to be the best or most detailed, and if you're someone who focuses heavily on edits when you're doing your first draft, I would go against it, but at the same time, everything I talk about is subjective. I'm just talking about what works for me, and it could work for you as well. As long as you understand your characters and the world they live in, you can breeze through your first draft with enough confidence that you could come back to it, re-edit it and rewrite it, and then add those final points in later. Point number 4 of how I actually write my books is, I'm pretty sure I'm the only person I know within my Instagram writing community circle that does this. This is going to be a bit hard to explain, so if you've got your pen and paper ready, feel free to pause the video at any... fucking hair in my face. Feel free to pause the video at any time, because I'm going to try and explain this as best as possible and why I actually do this. So before I start writing, I ask for beta readers. For any of you who don't know what beta readers are, they are essentially tester readers for your manuscript before you send it off to either an editor or a publishing house, depending on what route you want to go down. I ask for my beta readers first because I want them on standby, because basically what you need to know is I write my books in thirds. I don't write the full manuscript of, let's example, say 39 chapters, and then rewrite all of that, then rewrite all of that, then rewrite all of that. What I do is I write my first 13 chapters, essentially act 1 of my book. When I've written those first 13 chapters, as I said, in chronological order, and not much emphasis on what character is talking and character beats, unless it's needed for the plot. Once I've finished the 13th chapter, I go straight back to chapter 1. I try and get rid of as many spelling, grammar mistakes as possible, but I'm not really interested in that. What I'm more focused on is the story and the plot and the characters. So by the time I've done my first rewrite, all the way through chapter 13, I already have these first 13 chapters solid within each other. Then I'll do my next rewrite and my next rewrite. And by the time I've done my full rewrites of this first part, everything should make both chronological and plotting sense. Something that happens in chapter 2 will be verified in chapter 7. Chapter 13, it should all be this nice solid mass. I roughly do about 5 rewrites, and when these 5 rewrites are done, I then send that first part off to my beta readers. And whilst the first part is with my beta readers, I then start writing my second part. And again, I'll follow the same process. Example, 13 chapters. Also, something to note is I don't plan how many chapters there will be. But let's say it is 13 chapters, I will then start writing the next 13 chapters. And because I've got the first part so mashed in my head of, okay, this works, this works, this works, Act 2 is so much easier to write, and I'm so much more confident with it. And whilst I'm writing part 2, I then start to get feedback from part 1. And with this feedback, because it's good to have the feedback from the outside eyes, because as much as I think I've got it solidified, you know, that other set of eyes that goes, well, I'm not sure if Ryan would do this, or I'm not sure if that piece of scenery would look like that. You can then take that on board and fix it whilst you're doing part 2. And I follow this process with part 2, do those 13 chapters, take on board what the beta readers said. Once I've done my 5 to 6 rewrites of part 2, send that out to the beta readers again. Repeat the process with part 3. And whilst you're getting feedbacks for part 2, you can then solidify part 3 as well. And you've also managed to rewrite, before you send part 2 out as well, you've done the same process with part 1, rewrite, and you've got these 13 chapters, part 2 of your book, all solidified and all making sense as well. Follow this process till the end of part 3. Do 5-6 rewrites of it. Once you've got that certain, you know how the book wants to end and what the final act is going to be, send it out to the beta readers as well, and then wait. You need to wait, because when you get the feedback from the beta readers about how the book ends, that's when you know whether the story works itself or not. And then this is when I actually start full rewrites. Now, before I get on to how I do full rewrites, this might seem like a foreign concept of me writing my book in thirds, sending it out, third, send it out, third, send it out. The reason I don't want to write my full book and rewrite it as one, let's example say it's 39 chapters, as I've said. Let's say I start writing in January. By the time I've finished the 39th chapter, which would roughly be about June at the pace that I write, I'm then going back to start the rewrites, and that is the first time I have seen chapter 1 for nearly 6 months. So you then do your full rewrite, and you then realise something in chapter 3 doesn't match up with chapter 25, so you alter that. But you alter something in chapter 5, with that, which then means chapter 13 has something wrong with it, and so on and so forth. It just spreads out of this web, that stuff that can go wrong. This process of having to constantly make notes for these 39 chapters just wouldn't work for me. I'd rather work in smaller compartments and make sure they're more solidified, because when it does come for me to do my final rewrites before I send it off to my editor, it only takes me 2 rewrites, because I've put so much time and confidence into solidifying these 3 parts that the only things I really need to change do not correlate with each other. Even if it is one long continuous story, I've spent that much time solidifying these parts. They do tend to flow through, and anything that doesn't work, my beta readers have already pointed it out for me. Again, this is subjective, but that is really what works for me, writing in thirds and sending it out. I don't think I could mentally handle having 39 chapters in front of me, not seeing the first chapter for 6 months, and then going back and like, it could be quite cool, but like, oh, this is nice and fresh. Oh, I remember this. It would be nice going back to it. But you could be in such a different mood when you write chapter 39 that chapter 1 is a completely different story, which is good, because that means that the story itself has growth. but I like my stories to are consistent with each other, that the tone matches up all the way through. Plus, if I do get a new idea in my head and I'm writing in thirds, I can then figure out where that new idea will go. And if it's going into the part that I'm writing, I can add it then and just evolve it into the story naturally without me writing 39 chapters, doing a rewrite and thinking, oh, I'd love this to happen here, and then it just completely fuck the story. I like writing in thirds because I think it makes my stories a lot plot hole tighter. I've tried to think back whether there is some plot holes in my story. There's definitely some just pure fiction moments that wouldn't happen in real life. Welcome to the world of fiction. Yeah, I don't think there's any major plot holes or conveniences. I think everything within my stories makes logistical sense of why a character would do that or how a situation could happen. So there we have it. I write in chronological order. It's all about the character dialogue on the first draft. I will add in the finer details later on my rewrites. Scenery as well, I tend to make it very basic on my first draft, and then I buff it and build it up as I go along. And the final part, again, I think I'm the only person who does this, but I write my book in thirds. It's up to you how you want to write. At the end of the day, if you've got a pen and paper in front of you, a laptop or a typewriter, then anyone can write. It's up to you how much you want to put into it and how much of a detailed story you want to be. Now, people think that writing is easy, and I actually took writing up to, give myself something productive to do outside of work, then, not sitting around and drinking. And the amount of, detail and stress I put into my books is actually giving me massive anxiety. So win-lose situation, but there we go. Thank you for understanding why I've had to make a short video today. I've got snot coming at me. I've not even had any chili sauce yet. But this is for the aspiring writers out there, and that is an insight into my actual writing process. And just to let you know, the actual writing process itself, from when I write the first chapter up until when I send the last part out to my beta readers, is roughly about a year. But it's up to you how you write your book. It's up to you how you do your rewrites. This is just what works for me. But I encourage you all to find what works for you, and looking forward to seeing where you can take your writing journey. If you're new here, please subscribe. If you like the Writing Things video and you think this helps, please leave a like and a comment and let me know. Yeah, sorry about the cop-out for the Star Wars video, but I haven't got the strength to do that today. Yeah, as always, folks, hope you're doing well. Much love. Take care. Peace.